On December 28, 1992, in the quiet seaside town of Saltburn-by-the-Sea in England, 23-year-old Stephen Clark stepped out of his home for what should have been one of the most ordinary moments of his day. It wasn't late at night. It wasn't in a dangerous area. And there was nothing unusual about his plans. Stephen told his parents he was going for a short walk. His destination was simple: the public restroom near the seafront. A place he had been before, a route he knew well. A walk that should have taken only a few minutes. Saltburn-by-the-Sea is not a large, chaotic city where someone could easily disappear into a crowd. It's the kind of place where people recognize familiar faces, where routines are noticed, where something out of place tends to stand out. And yet, on that day, nothing stood out. There were no reports of a disturbance. No witnesses who came forward to say they saw something suspicious. No indication that anything unusual had happened at all. Stephen left his home and began walking, and somewhere along that short, familiar route, he vanished. Not hours later, not days later, but within a window of time so small, it almost defies explanation. Because when investigators later tried to piece together what happened, they were left with a timeline that didn't make sense. A young man walks out of his home in the middle of the day, in a quiet coastal town, heading somewhere close by, and then simply ceases to exist. No confirmed sightings after he left. No evidence that he reached his destination. No trace of where he went, or what might have happened in those missing moments. And in cases like this, where the timeline is so tight and the location so controlled, the questions become even more unsettling. Because if Stephen Clark didn't make it to where he was going, then something must have happened in between. Something quick, something unexpected, something that left behind no clear evidence and no easy answers. More than 3 decades later, that short walk still remains one of the most baffling disappearances in the United Kingdom. Because in just a matter of minutes, a 23-year-old man walked out of his home and was never seen again. To understand why Stephen Clark's disappearance is so unsettling, it's important to take a closer look at who he was and the kind of life he was living before that day. Because this isn't a case where someone suddenly broke away from a chaotic or unstable situation. In fact, it's the opposite. Stephen was 23 years old in 1992, living with his parents in Saltburn-by-the-Sea, a quiet coastal town where routines tend to define daily life. He wasn't someone constantly moving from place to place or seeking out change. His world was small, familiar, and consistent. And that consistency played a major role in how he navigated everyday life. Stephen had a visual impairment that affected his ability to move through unfamiliar environments. Because of that, he relied heavily on routine, repetition, and known surroundings. The places he went, the routes he walked, the spaces he occupied. All of it was built around familiarity. This meant that stepping outside of that routine wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be genuinely difficult. So when we look at his disappearance, that detail becomes incredibly important. Because Stephen wasn't someone who would easily adapt to suddenly traveling somewhere new, blending into a different environment, or starting over in an unfamiliar place. He stayed close to home. He followed patterns. He lived within a structure that made sense to him. People who knew him described him as quiet, predictable, and deeply connected to his daily routine. There were no signs that he was planning to leave that life behind. No evidence that he had been preparing to go anywhere else. No packed bags, no withdrawn money, No conversations about wanting to disappear or start fresh. Nothing that would suggest this was a planned decision. And when someone who depends on routine disappears without warning, it doesn't just raise the question of where they went. It raises a deeper question. What could have happened that was powerful enough, sudden enough, to completely break that routine and remove them from it entirely? Because for Stephen Clark, his life didn't slowly drift off course. It appears to have been interrupted, abruptly, and without explanation. With no physical evidence to guide the investigation, police were left with something far less reliable: theories. And in cases like this, where the facts are limited, theories can quickly begin to shape the direction of the case. One of the first possibilities considered was that Stephen may have suffered some kind of accident. It's often the most straightforward explanation. Perhaps he had fallen somewhere out of sight. Perhaps he had become disoriented and wandered off course. Perhaps there was a location nearby that had not yet been thoroughly searched. But as time went on, that theory became harder to support. Search efforts had already covered the most likely areas, and nothing had been found. No location where he could have fallen and remained hidden for decades. No evidence of injury. No indication that he had left the immediate area at all. Which led to another possibility: that Stephen had chosen to disappear, that he had left voluntarily, for reasons unknown. But this theory also came with significant problems. There was no evidence that Stephen had been unhappy with his life, no signs of conflict, no indication that he had been planning to leave or preparing for a new start. And perhaps most importantly, there was no trace of him ever appearing anywhere else. No bank activity, no confirmed sightings, no communication with anyone after that day. To voluntarily disappear and remain undetected for this long would require careful planning, resources, and a level of independence that did not align with how Stephen lived his life. Especially given his reliance on routine and familiar environments, which leaves a much more difficult conclusion: that whatever happened to Stephen Clark was not something he chose, and that the truth behind his disappearance may lie somewhere between the possibilities that investigators have struggled to prove and the ones they have never been able to fully rule out. As the initial search efforts came to an end, the investigation into Stephen Clark's disappearance began to slow. The urgency that surrounds the first days of a missing persons case gradually faded, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and eventually into years. But despite the passage of time, one thing remained unchanged. There were still no answers, no confirmed sightings, no evidence pointing investigators in a clear direction. And for Stephen's family, that absence of answers created a different kind of struggle. Because when someone disappears without explanation, there is no clear way to process what has happened. There is no certainty, no closure, only possibilities. And those possibilities can become overwhelming. Did something happen that day that no one saw? Was there something overlooked in the early stages of the investigation? Or was the truth always just out of reach, hidden somewhere in the details that didn't seem important at the time? Over the years, the case began to drift further from public attention. New cases emerged, new investigations took priority, and Stephen Clark's disappearance became one of many unsolved mysteries. But for those closest to him, it never truly went away, because even as time moved forward, the questions remained exactly where they had been since the beginning. What happened to Stephen Clark, and how could someone vanish so completely, without leaving behind even the smallest piece of evidence to explain it? Years after Stephen Clark disappeared, the case took a turn that few people expected. Investigators began to re-examine the details, looking again at the timeline, the statements, the gaps that had never been fully explained. And as they revisited the case, their attention shifted, not outward, but inward, toward the people who had been closest to Stephen on the day he vanished, his parents. It's a shift that can happen in long-term investigations, especially when there are no clear suspects and no physical evidence pointing in another direction. Investigators begin to look again at the last known interactions, the last people to see the missing person alive, the details that may have seemed insignificant at the time, but could take on new meaning years later. Questions were raised about inconsistencies in statements, about the exact timeline of events, about what could be confirmed and what could not. And slowly, the focus of the investigation began to change. The very people who had reported Stephen missing were now being looked at through a different lens, not just as family members searching for answers, but as potential suspects. It's a shift that carries a heavy emotional weight, because it introduces a new possibility, that the truth behind Stephen Clark's disappearance may not lie in a random encounter or an unexplained accident, but somewhere much closer to home. Decades after Stephen Clark was last seen, the case was reopened, and in a development that brought renewed attention to the mystery. Police made a decision that would once again change the direction of the investigation. Stephen's parents were arrested on suspicion of murder. For many, it was a shocking moment, a sign that investigators believed there was enough concern, enough unanswered questions, to justify taking that step. It suggested that the case was not as dormant as it had seemed, that behind the scenes, something had shifted. But as quickly as that development raised expectations, it also brought the case back to a familiar place, because despite the arrests, no charges were ultimately filed. Stephen's parents were released, and the investigation once again faced the same problem it had struggled with from the very beginning: a lack of definitive evidence, no body, no clear cause, no undeniable proof of what had happened. And without that proof, the case could not move forward, which left investigators and the public with a difficult reality. Even after all those years, even after revisiting the case with fresh eyes, the central question remained unanswered. What actually happened to Stephen Clark? When a case remains unsolved for decades, it often becomes less about evidence and more about possibilities, because without clear answers, people begin to fill in the gaps, trying to make sense of what doesn't make sense. One possibility is that Stephen suffered some kind of accident that was never discovered, that something happened along that short route, something that went unnoticed in the initial search. Another possibility is that he encountered someone unexpectedly, a chance meeting that turned into something far more serious, something that removed him from that path and erased any clear trace of where he went next. And then there is the possibility that continues to create debate, that the truth lies closer to home, that the inconsistencies in the timeline, the questions that remain unresolved, may point towards something that has never been fully uncovered. But each of these possibilities comes with its own challenges. Each one lacks the evidence needed to confirm it. And that is what makes this case so difficult. Because every theory feels incomplete. Every explanation leaves something unanswered. And the more you examine the details, the more it becomes clear that no single version of events fully explains what happened that day, which means that after all this time, the truth may still be hidden somewhere between those possibilities, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps lost entirely. On a winter day in 1992, Stephen Clark left his home in a quiet seaside town. He wasn't traveling far. He wasn't entering a dangerous situation. He was simply walking a short, familiar route in the middle of the day. A routine moment in a place where nothing unusual was expected to happen. And yet, that moment became the last confirmed piece of his story. More than 3 decades later, his disappearance remains unsolved. No confirmed sightings, no physical evidence, no clear explanation of how or why he vanished. Only a timeline that ends too suddenly, and questions that have never been answered, because somewhere between his front door and where he intended to go, something happened, something quick, something unexplained, something that removed him from that place without leaving behind a trace. And that is what makes the case of Stephen Clark so haunting. Not just that he disappeared, but how completely he disappeared. As if, for a brief moment, he stepped out of the world everyone else could see and was never able to return. If you're drawn to cases like this, where the smallest details can hold the biggest unanswered questions, make sure to subscribe to Whispered Crimes. And let me know in the comments, what do you think happened to Stephen Clark?